Welcome to the Pipe Band Drumming YouTube channel. Today, you're going to learn about the top 5 types of tunes that we play in pipe band drumming: marches, Strathspeys, reels, hornpipes, and jigs. And we're going to look at their tempo, time signature, the expression, and the different rhythmic structures that you'll see show up. I'm going to be sharing that iPad screen so you can actually see how they look. And I've invited in Jori Chisholm, world champion bagpiper, so we can hear about it from a piping end as well. So if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe and the notification bell so you get updated every time I share a free tutorial. I hope you enjoy. Well, folks, we're going to look at the fundamentals of pipe band tune types. And I just want to introduce Jori Chisholm, a great friend of mine. We got to know each other in SFU. We played at Simon Fraser University pipe band back in the early 2000s, the late 2000s. Jori was in the band actually for around 20 years. And I've learned a lot from Jori over the years. We've spent a lot of time teaching alongside each other in Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and all over North America. So Jori, a massive welcome.
Thanks, James. Great to be with you. I know we've got a lot of common interests in pipe band music, and playing pipes and drums together is definitely one of them. So thanks for doing this together, and I hope we can come up with something that's useful for people.
Absolutely. I know we definitely will. And guys, for those that are here on YouTube, please take a second just to hit the subscribe button and that little notification bell, because Jori and I will be putting more and more tutorials up that will be valuable to you. So Jori, let's jump in. Let's have a little look at. I know that you've got quite an amazing framework of how you picture the tune type. So maybe we could start with that as a bit of an overarching vision.
Sure. So when we talk about the most commonly played types of bagpipe tunes, there's this area of pibroch that we're not going to talk about, but in the non-pibroch domain, we call that light music. And then those are the types of tunes that you'll have pipers and drummers playing together. There's 3 primary categories. There are slow airs, and a lot of times those tunes come from songs, although a lot of them are just written as pipe tunes. We have marches, and we have dance tunes. Now, today we're going to talk mostly about 2/4 marches in the march category, but there are also 3/4s, 4/4s, 6/8s, 9/8s, and that might be the topic of another one of these videos to talk more about marches. Today we're going to focus on 2/4s. Now, in the dance tunes, we have Strathspeys, reels, jigs, and hornpipes. So I think that's what we're going to look at today. It'll be 2/4 marches, Strathspeys, reels, jigs, and hornpipes, and just look a little into the structure of these tunes, what you're going to see when you're looking at the sheet music, time signatures, rhythmic patterns, and then also how you take that written music and make something musical out of it. So looking at pulsing, expression, timing, things to look for, things to strive for to bring out the most in your tunes. So if that sounds good, where should we start, James?
Yeah, so for those that are sitting here about to kind of get into this, so the whole idea is we want you to walk away from this having those the understanding of, when I see a march, I know it's going to be in this tempo range. I know that the rhythms that are going to show up in that march are going to be these rhythms, and I know that the expression and the musicality or the phrasing that I want to add to it is this. So we're trying to demystify all these different things that people talk about when it comes to different tune types, so there's more clarity for you. So perhaps I might just share my iPad screen here, and just as Jori and I chat through it, we're just going to casually chat through each tune type. Maybe marches might be a good place to start. And 2 wee seconds. Yeah, sure, Jori, maybe if we start with 2/4 marches, I'll just get this iPad set up and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so the reason we're focusing on 2/4s today is that the 2/4 march is the most common style of march played in a pipe band competition. When you're playing a march, Strathspey, and reel, an MSR as we call it, it's always going to be a 2/4. So that's what we're looking at, and that's what we're focusing on today.
Brilliant. So let's take a little look at that 2/4 march. And I'm going to write in monolinear notation. So a lot of you drummers will be used to this. Pipers, you might find this a bit strange, but essentially it's one line. Us drummers like to keep it simple. Anything above the line is right and left. So let's ignore right and left. We're just going to be putting rhythm down on a page. This notation, for those history buffs, was developed by Fritz Berger, a Swiss drummer, back in the 1928, 1929 was when this came to fruition. So that's what I'll be notating. So let's take a little look there. So when we think of 2/4, Jori, maybe what tempo would we be, range-wise, would we be thinking of?
Well, at the upper end for solo pipers, you're looking at about 70. And if you're an amateur piper and you're, in one of the amateur grades is going to be slower. I like between 60 and 70 for solo piping. Bands are going to be higher, right? In bands, we're playing faster. And at the high level grade 1 bands at the Worlds, we're going to be talking, maybe upwards of 80. Is that right, James?
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the higher ones that I've heard being like 86, 87 BPM, but probably ranging from 76 up to late 80s, would you say, across all grades?
Yeah, I think that's right. That's one of the things that will be coming out, and I think in our conversation today and what I'm looking forward to learning from you, James, a little bit more is about the differences in how we play tunes, or how pipers will play tunes when we're playing with drummers, and the reasons for that. And typically the tempos are cranked up, and when you're playing on your own as a piper, the tempos are pulled back, and we're really getting into really heavy expression, because when you're playing on your own as a piper, you have to do it all. You have to be bringing out all that beat emphasis. Whereas when you're playing with the band, you have the drummers helping you with dynamics and rhythmic interest and contrast. And one of the things that we do is we crank the tempos up to make it more exciting.
Totally. And before we get into that, I guess we'll just basically look at, so this could be what you might see in terms of a 2/4 bar, right? 2 quarter notes. So that's pretty simple and straightforward in terms of that's what we're going to see in each bar. But if we were to look at the rhythms here, Jori, what rhythm might we see show up in a 2/4 march?
Well, it depends on the complexity of the tune. And this is probably the way that I would, you could most easily distinguish what's a more complicated or difficult tune from a simpler tune is just how many notes do you have in each bar or in each beat. So the simplest would be just a quarter note on each beat. You could also break those quarter notes into pairs. So you could have pairs of even eighth notes. You could have pairs of notes where the first one's dotted, which would mean it's held longer, and the second one is cut, meaning it's shorter. You could have a reversal of that, which would be the cut dot. The note lengths are the same, they're just reversed. Then we can just get more complex from there. So if we want to keep going, imagine you took that first pair of eighth notes there and you split the second eighth note into 2. So now you'd have an eighth note and 2 sixteenths, right? But in these competition style marches, you usually, in the pipe score, you do not have even sixteenths. So that first one's going to have a dot and then a cut on the second one. You could do that same 3-note pattern, but have the dot cut reversed. Exactly. I wasn't thinking that, but I was actually thinking the dot cut reverse, but you could do that. So it's actually going to be 4 different 3-note pairs. The eighth note can be first, the eighth note can be second. And then in the half that's not the eighth note, it can either be dot cut or cut dot, right? So, right, exactly. Cut dot eighth. And just as sort of a side note here, the first and third ones on that line are by far the most common. And that because that we'll get into that later, but that heavy beat emphasis lines up with the way that they compose the tunes, meaning the longest note of those 3 is usually the downbeat. Doesn't have to be. And some composers, they like do it the other way around. Then we get 4-note groupings. So you imagine you took each one of those eighth notes and split it into a 16th, you'd have 4 sixteenths. But remember, we mentioned that we don't have even sixteenths, we need dots and cuts. So it could be dot, cut, dot, cut. It could be the reverse of that. It could be cut, dot, cut, dot. We could have a really cool rhythm, which is the dots at the beginning and the end. So a dot, cut, cut, dot. And that's used to great effect in a lot of tunes. And then the reverse of that, which would be the 2 dots in the middle.
For those who are looking at this going, wow, this is overwhelming. There are so many options. Once you understand the basics of how the rhythm works, that's what you're thinking of there, Jori?
Yep. And that's it. I think that's it. We got quarter notes. We have 3 different 2-note pairs. We have 4 different 3-note pairs.
This is going to be something the pipers won't see, but the drummers will. Right? The pipers would be highly unlikely to see this in a 2/4 march.
I can think of a couple, but these are outlier tunes. We usually don't have these really fast triplets in our 2/4s.
So us drummers, what we would do, so when the pipers go 1 E and a 2, we can go ta 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 ta, and that will complement that. So essentially these two here. So the pipers would play the top one, and we could play the bottom one. You might see that turn up as a Swiss triplet run, ika-cha. But what we look at here is this note and this note, this note and this note should be lining up with those dots and cuts. Now, this is where when we get down to looking at the mathematics and the theory of it, the fine detail, this is where pipers and drummers can go, actually, no, what you're doing is slightly rounded. But this is, again, where we have to have discussions as pipe major and leading drummer or as instructors to make sure rhythmically what the drum corps is doing actually complements what's happening on the page there.
Right. And I think this is a good time to mention sort of what is the purpose of sheet music. And sheet music, the way I look at it is it's a guide. And at least in the piping side of things, it will show all the notes. It will show all the grace notes and all the doublings, assuming you have a good score that's not filled with typos or has been somehow messed up by somebody. If it's a proper score, it's going to have all the notes. It's going to have all the grace notes. It's going to give you clues with the dots and cuts and the different rhythmic patterns on how you should play the tune, but it is not going to tell you everything about how to play the tune, right? There is some additional knowledge that you need to apply to that written score. And that's, I think, what we're going to talk about next is sort of what are these, how would we do that? How would we express a tune properly? And if you've ever heard the playback feature that's used on some of these bagpipe notation programs, these programs are really good for making beautiful copies of pipe tunes to share online or to print in a book or frame and put on a wall. But the computer won't play it right. It sounds like a robot. And one of the reasons is that the program is they're taking the written notation literally, and they're not putting that extra layer of expression into it, which is, you need to do it. So the sheet music is not a perfect scientific depiction of how the tune is played. It's a guide. And then you need to apply your understanding of the rules of expression for that particular style of tune to make it sound good. Great.
I like that term, rules of expression. And this is where, for as a drummer, we experience, say, a drum kit player or an American drumline drummer coming across the pipe band music, and they're very much used to seeing everything almost robotic and mathematically, theoretically in place. And they say, but you're doing this funny thing here, like this thing swings, or you're holding this note. And that's what we're talking about with the rules of expression. We do unique things in the pipe band world that are different from any type of music.
That's right. And I think many different styles of music have these rules or these traditions or these patterns that are built in. And if you've been doing it a really long time, you may not even realize you're doing it. Sort of like a native speaker of a language doesn't pick up on the quirks and the idiosyncrasies of their language the way that you would if you were learning it as a second language in a more academic setting. So let's get into it. Where should we start with expression for 2/4 marches?
So with the rhythms here, well, Jori and I will not get into detail on this now. We will probably both do separate videos, extra tutorials on this, but it's very important that when you see what's written, that you can interpret that and produce the rhythmic equivalent. So for example, this one here, 1 E and a 2 E and a, being able to look at that and understand what the rhythmic expression comes out as. So that's an important lesson and skill set in itself. So we're not going to jump deep into that, but with the expression, Jori, so if we take, say, the basic, if we go right up to the top and you've got your quarter notes, if we were to teach someone, hey, this is the basic pulsing of a 2/4, what would it be?
So pulsing is a term we use for emphasizing certain notes in the tune. And in a 2/4 march, what we want to do is we want to emphasize each beat. Well, if your bar is just 2 quarter notes, there's not much you can do to it. But as soon as you have 2 or more notes within a beat, you can pulse it. And what you're doing is you're going to emphasize the first note on the beat by lengthening it slightly. That's what pipers will do. And the reason that pulsing is so important with pipe music is that bagpipes, we have no dynamics, right? Bagpipes are all one volume. We can't go louder or softer just because of the way the instrument is built. And we also have no rests. So that's one reason that pipe band music is so exciting, is because the drummers have, you guys have lots of dynamic range, and you can come in and come out, and it really, drums and pipes go very well together for that reason, because we complement each other. So what we would do is I would actually look at lengthening that one you circled there, and I would do the other one as well. Now, some people may talk about the left foot beat, which is the first beat of each bar, or the right foot beat being a little bit less pulsed. But I think for a good starting point, we want to lengthen those notes. So here's the key concept. What you've written there are 4/8 notes, 2/8 notes in each beat. And according to the way you've notated it, they should be dead even. You have a single beat that's split into 2 notes, 8th note, 8th note. There's no dot, there's no cut. But what pulsing does is we actually lengthen that first note slightly. And we do that, if you do it just the right amount, it still sounds even, but you have a very subtle but powerful beat emphasis. And that's what pulsing is doing, is we are lengthening that note a little bit in order to bring out that beat, to emphasize that beat. And for the pipers, again, it's really important because there's no other way we can do it. We can't play it louder. Like you could accent a note, but we can't do that. We accent it by lengthening it.
What's interesting when it comes to 2/4 marches, if you're a competitive piper or drummer, or you're in a band, and you get some feedback from a judge, and they say the 2/4 march sounded boxy, or it sounded a little too rounded. What they're saying is that you're not expressing these notes. You're not adding that agogic stress. You're not adding that emphasis. So Jori, if we were to take something like Highland Wedding, and just the first 2 bars of Highland Wedding, and we were to play it absolutely as like 1 and 2 and let's hear, or even just if you want to sing it, just what it might sound like if we were robotic and super mathematical with it, versus adding that little bit of, is Highland Wedding a good example of a tune that we could use?
Yeah, it's a perfect example because it has a bunch of 8th notes at the beginning. So if you were to look at Highland Wedding, it starts with 4 8th notes in a row, and then it gets into some more complex rhythms, but it would go dee da da dee da dee dee da 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 dee da da dee da 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 dee da da, with pulsing. So a little bit, instead of sounding like dun 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 dun, it sounds like dun dun. It brings it from having a 4/4-ish sound to a 2/4 sound, because you're taking it out of those 4/8 notes. Instead of making them all even, I'm bringing out the first and the third one. They become a little bit more prominent by lengthening them. So it really brings out the 2 beats per bar. And that's what we want. That's what the effect of the pulsing is. It brings out a strong 2 pulse. If you get rid of all the pulsing, you just have 4 even 8th notes. So another way to think about that is, if you look at those pairs of 8th notes, the first one, that's the front half of the beat. The second one, that's the back half of the beat. They sometimes call that the off beat. And what we're doing is we're lengthening the front of the beat, and we're shortening the off beat. Or we're delaying the offbeat. We're delaying the start of that second note. And if you do it just right, it sounds really, really good, because it brings out that strong 2/4 feel. One of the overriding principles for these, all of these styles of tune, except for maybe the jig, is that we really want to bring out the beat. We want to emphasize the beat. And on the bagpipes, the way you emphasize that beat is by lengthening the front of the beat. And we do that, we call it pulsing.
Love it. That's brilliant. And from a drumming end, it's so important that we understand that, because from a drumming end, it's easy to get mathematical and just focus on digits and numbers. But actually, it's about feeling, it's about expression. So, close your eyes and listen to what the pipers are doing. And it's our job to accompany that and emphasize what they're doing. So for a drum score, cool, mathematically big tick, but there's no swing, there's no feel. Right away, it's like, oh, I'm interested in this. This has expression that complements what the pipers are doing. And it's the slightest adjustment. Now, the argument for some of you guys watching this might be, but why don't you notate that? Why don't we put some kind of digit or dot or, well, because what ends up happening is it becomes incredibly messy, and to actually theoretically do that may become next to impossible. But if we can in some way theoretically write it out, you're going to have a very messy sheet of music. And so that's why
it'd be messy. Yeah, it would be messy, and it's also very difficult. And there's a much simpler way to achieve the desired goal, which is what I said a few minutes ago, which is the music is a guide. It's not a scientific, literal depiction of how it's played. And that goes for every style of music. You interpret it based on your knowledge and understanding properly. I mean, there's nothing about a dot that intrinsically shows that makes the note longer. You had to be taught that's what the dot means, right? Okay. So just like you have to be taught what the sounds are that go with different letters, and then you know that the different letters have different sounds depending on the context, right? So there's lots of knowledge that you apply to it. Because you're a person, that's how we learn. We don't interpret things literally like a computer would. We have these expression rules that we can apply.
And one thing I'm going to add in there, so many of you may have came across this idea of strong weak. So often what you'll get shared from judges and others and teachers is you might hear, well, a 2/4 march is about strong weak. So what they're trying to say there is that the first beat in the bar should be strong and the second beat in the bar should be weak. Now, that's a guideline, and that's not, hey, every single bar is going to do that. There are going to be times, particularly from a drumming end, when we don't hit this big, strong accent. In fact, we might do the opposite and go for the upbeat rather than the downbeat. So that's would you say from a piping end, that's something you guys would talk about, is strong, weak, strong, weak?
Some people do. I actually think that's making it more confusing and not entirely, I think that's not as accurate as to think that all your beats are strong, right? That's what the pulsing does. When you talk about strong, you meaning, I guess for drummers, that could be loud. You could have an accent there to make it strong, but in the piping world, there's no accenting. There's only lengthening through pulsing. So the way I try to play.
Sorry, I just want to jump in. What you just said is gold. That's so important. That to me, this is a breakthrough moment for pipers and drummers. So when we think as drummers, strong, weak, we think accent, no accent, accent, no accent. Whereas for you guys, that's not the case. So this is where I think this conversation is so important. Jori is saying we can't have a louder note and a softer note as pipers. And so it's about lengthening. So when we understand that as drummers, that also tells us that we're not going to go accent, soft note, accent. We don't need to do that. More importantly, what we do need to do is really make sure that we're lengthening each of those downbeats just the same way the pipers are. And we can add in an accent here when we want to, when it's appropriate. You know, and we can also shift that to the second beat or the upbeat. To me, that's really crucial, what you just said, Jori. So thanks for sharing it with that filter.
Yeah. So what we have in common, where we overlap, is timing, right? So bagpipers have timing, rhythm, tempo, dot cut, pulsing. That's all related to timing. And then we have the different melody notes and embellishments that we play on top of that. You guys have the timing and dynamics, right? You don't have different melody notes. You just got the one note when you play your drum. So really the crucial thing is to get the timing synced up in terms of the tempo, in terms of, you know, where you're hitting, if you're emphasizing a downbeat or an offbeat, if you're accenting or not accenting. Just like we have to distinguish as pipers, the melody notes are one dimension, but then the rhythm and the pulsing and the tempo are another dimension, right? And you've got the accenting and the dynamic range that's sort of independent of or it's a separate dimension from the timing domain. So obviously it's not random. They're synchronized if you're doing it right. You want to put the accents on the long notes to accent certain beats, right? Absolutely. Same thing with us. Our certain embellishments tend to come on downbeats to emphasize them. So that's really the key thing. Now you will talk to some pipers who will have very complex expression schemes that they claim to use or that they claim are real, oh, well, in the first bar, I go strong, weak. And in the second bar, I go weak, strong. And then there's mediums and stuff. I actually don't believe that's an accurate way of describing how most people play. Now, I'm not saying that no one plays like that, but I'm saying I don't think that that's really how most people play. The way I play, the way I teach, the way that I think most pipers play is we just try to keep a steady tempo. We have a consistent rhythm expression in terms of our dot cut, and we're doing a strong amount of pulsing, and we're not fluctuating throughout the tune. We're not sometimes doing really heavy pulsing and then less heavy pulsing or really heavier. I just don't think that that's desirable, or even if that it's really possible. It just seems too complicated. If you listen to the best 2/4 march players, in my opinion, they are very consistent with that strong, heavy pulsed beat, and they're in a groove, right? And I think if you were even able to come up with some complex varying expression scheme, I don't think that that would be desirable. This music is very rhythmic, and it's very much about getting in a groove and getting some momentum, and just we're talking marching music and we're talking dance music. So this is very regular kind of rhythmic stuff, which is not the case for all types of music, but it's certainly the case for pipe band music.
Absolutely. And that's important. You already think, when people are out there, YouTube in particular has lots of options in terms of, hey, here's how you play pipes or drums. But for those of you out there who are on a learning journey, which I guess we all are to some degree, but I want you to just challenge who you're learning from. And when people have really radical different approaches to whether it's piping, drumming, violin, whatever, I want you just to question it. And then through the filter of, hey, success leaves clues. So Jori and I, we would look to who are the best players, and we've played alongside the best players, and we've both played at the top level ourselves, but we continue to look at what are they doing? Oh, 99% of them are all doing that. We all kind of think that, okay, that's an accepted way of playing. So if you're learning from somebody that has a very radical view, just question it and then get out there and see what the majority of great players are doing.
Yeah. I think I love alternative approaches. I love thinking outside the box, but in this case, I think the simpler explanation and the simpler approach is the correct one. Like, we're going for a groove, we're going to hit some sort of rhythmic consistency, and I think that's the right approach. Brilliant.
So Jori, which tune type should we move through to now? Is that everything 2/4 march?
Yeah. I mean, we can go deeper, of course, but let's move on here. Well, in the MSR, starts with the 2/4 march, then goes to a Strathspey. So let's go there. So a Strathspey is 4/4, 4 quarter notes per bar. And you've got, so the simplest form would be 4 quarter notes. Now, what's different between a Strathspey and like a 4/4 march, like Scotland the Brave, or one of these other 4/4 marches that we know, one of the things is that Strathspeys are going to be way faster, right? So we're talking, well, again, when you're playing in solo piping, you have a lot of leeway, but we're talking, 100 anyway, right?
From a band perspective, you're probably looking anywhere from 100 to at the very top end, 130, and that will go for solo drumming as well. 130 is incredibly fast, but you will see it. And then solo piping around 100 to what would the top end be?
Yeah, so the top professionals would probably be at 120.
Okay.
And again, I mean, don't take these numbers as absolutes. If you're just getting into solo piping competitions, you have a lot of leeway to go on the slower end. Everybody would much rather hear you play something slower and have you do a good job with it than try to strive to meet the some sort of tempo benchmark and have it be a disaster. So what's interesting about Strathspeys as compared to marches is that we have no even pairs of eighth notes in a Strathspey pipe tune. Your pairs of notes are either going to be dot cut with a long note first. That does not exist. or it's going to be cut dot with the short note coming first. The other rhythmic pattern that we have a lot is a triplet. You know, sometimes it's actually 3 even notes played in a beat, although it's not that common to actually play it as 3 even notes. In a lot of the old books, they would write it that way, but we play the first 2 notes short. So it's almost like 2 cut notes and a dot note, although it's usually written as 2/16 and an eighth, right? So it's like a short, short, long. There's another couple triplets. You could have the long note in the middle, but that's extremely rare. So the quarter note, your dot cut, your cut dot, and your triplet, that's going to cover 99.5% of your Strathspeys as far as the pipe tune goes.
Yeah, and that's, I'm just going to add in there from a drumming end, you're going to see this, and I'll break those up. You're going to see, we would call this a run of 5, but you'll see I put a 3 over the top. So 3 groupings in the time of 2. So what we've got here is digga digga da, but it's actually a subdivision of that triplet. Okay, and then you may also see this, which is subdividing all of those 8th notes into 3 groups of 16th notes. Digga 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 da, digga 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 da. That's essentially what we're going to be seeing. So you've got ta ta up at the top here, number 1, and you've got ta ta, and you've got your ta, and then triplet, ta ta ta, and then here we've got digga da, and then 6 is digga digga da, and then 7 digga 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 da, and that's me ending on the next downbeat over here. So those are the key rhythmic options that you'll see. So Jori, what about in terms of the expression? So how does that differ from what we do in our march?
Well, there's a lot of overlap. So I don't know if we mentioned it, but in any dot cut style tune, it's really important that you hold those dots and you make those cut notes really short. I would say that is the primary thing that you want to focus on in your expression, is making sure that the dots are long and the short notes are really short. And from a technical point of view, that's one of the biggest challenges that pipers have, is cut those short notes short, especially when you get your tempos fast and you got doublings and all these other embellishments that are stuck in there. The first thing that goes is the length of those short notes. They get too, they get rounded out. So we want to make those really short. The additional thing that we're going to do in Strathspeys is we want to bring out the first and third beat in each bar. So the pulsing now takes place over the entire bar. So instead of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. So you're really stretching out that first and third beat. And that's it. If I was going to summarize how to properly play a Strathspey in terms of expression, a very strong dot cut, and then extra emphasis on the first and third beats by stretching out the dot of the first and third beat, and that's what we call pulsing. So lots of pulsing on 1 and 3 and lots of dot cut, and then you're good to go.
To me, that sums it up. There's always, I find from experiences teaching for the last couple of decades, that drummers and pipers will have varying thoughts on this. So strong weak, medium weak. You see it in a lot of theory books. A lot of people talk about it, but Jori and I have chatted at length about this. So to do a strong note versus a medium note on a bagpipe, it's like, what does that even mean? So actually, when you look at what most people are doing, is strong and then not strong. In terms of length, we're talking length, not accent here. So if we did it as a drummer and we just thought about the length, we would follow the bagpipers. But if we think of our accenting, it's actually easier for us to play, let's say 0 is, or 1 is weak, 10 is strong, 5 is medium. We can do that for sure. So from a drumming point of view, if you want to do strong, weak, medium, weak, or any variation, that's cool, that's possible. But what Jori's saying is the first note of the bar and the third note of the bar, you hold and you express each of those. Cha, is that cha, is that cha? Would that be the Caledonian Society of London be a good example?
Yeah. So that's exactly right. So when you will hear the terminology strong, weak, medium, weak thrown around, and when you ask pipers, what do you know about Strathspey expression? That's what they say. If they know anything, that's what they say. And what they're meaning is pulsing strong on the first bar, first beat, weak, which means I guess no pulsing on the second beat, medium, so some, like pulsing on the third beat, but maybe not as much as the first one, and then the fourth one's weak again. Now I think some people play that, but I think the way that most really good Strathspey playing comes across when you really listen to it carefully, that third beat is quite strong. And you can argue the fine details here, but I think if your approach is pulsing on 1 and 3, making them both equally strong, I think that's a good starting point. I just don't know that you can really pull off a medium and a weak. You know, when you're pulsing, the amount of pulsing on a beat will affect the amount of pulsing on the following beat, right? So the stronger you make one, the weaker that number 2 will be. And the same thing goes for 3 and 4. So I think it makes sense that it has to be strong, weak, strong, weak. But I've just gotten rid of that terminology entirely. And I say pulsing on 1 and 3.
Essentially there, guys.
Mm-hmm. So what that means is that if we look specifically at what you're going to do, if you look at that bar, it's the same rhythmic pattern 4 times, but they are not played identically. You're going to make the dotted note on the first beat and the dotted note on the third beat longer. Those are going to be they're going to be slightly longer than the dotted notes on the second and fourth beat. Actually, technically, like if you were to record it, someone who's pulsing it properly and rewind it and time it and actually measure the lengths of those notes, that dotted note on 1 and 3 will be the longest notes of the bar. 2 and 4 will be slightly less long, and all those short notes will be the same.
Hold on. Now, Jori, should we?
That's a crucial bit there, is that you want all those short notes to be the same. Yeah, let's move on.
These notes. Yeah. So reel. So what is our standard time signature in an MSR, a traditional March Strathspey reel?
Reel would be cut common time or cut time, also known as 2-2. That's an interesting one because the 2 on the bottom means half note. We usually don't have half notes, but what we do end up having is 4 quarter notes, where it's instead of a quarter note on each beat, we have 2 quarter notes on the first beat, 2 quarter notes on the second beat. Another way to think about it is it's just like 4-4, except for instead of tapping our foot 4 times, we just tap it twice on the first and the third. Yeah.
What about tempo range there? So we think solo piping.
Let's take a look here. Yeah, so on the high end, it would probably be 80, into the 80s for reels. At the low end, it might be even 60, somewhere in there. Could be, again, it can always be slower if you're in the entry level solo piping grades.
Probably, again, from a band or a solo drumming perspective, slow would be early 70s, and then getting up into that brisk, fast tempo at the top end, you're looking at late 80s.
Yep.
And then
our rhythmic groupings are going to be very similar to what we had in a 2-4 march. So we could have 4 quarter notes. Each one of those quarter notes could be, actually, yeah, we don't get into the 4-note groupings. Really, we're talking quarter notes and 8th note pairs, right? But in an MSR, you were going to have dot cuts. There are 2 styles of reels. Sometimes in medleys or in recitals, you'll hear pipers playing round style reels. I'm not sure where that comes from, if that's from the Irish side or what, but you do have that. But again, you could have dot cuts or cut dots. And then when you mix them all up, you can get dot, cut, dot, just like in the 2-4, you can kind of scramble them all up. But there's really only 3 different rhythms. You got a quarter note, dot, cut, or cut, dot. But then once you mix them all up, you get lots of interesting combos.
And again, we can subdivide this. Remember, in our March, we looked at the triplication. You get exactly the same thing here. So just to write that out for you quickly, that will look like this. So we could play that when the pipers are playing dun da dun da dun da dun da. We can play dicka da dicka da dicka da dicka da. And we often do that when we're rolling. Our rolls very often are irregular groups and triplet based. So that's how we think when we're playing those. And then expression, Jori. What's your take on expression there?
Yeah, so It's like a march where you're bringing out your beats, but I think because the tempos are faster and it's a little bit more easygoing, laid back approach than a 2/4 march. So I'm still looking at pulsing my 2 beats per bar, but maybe not quite as heavy as you would have in a 2/4 march. You know, something like John Morrison, you wouldn't go if you're playing it as a 2/4, be heavier, be slower, more pounding out those beats. But here we'd be holding the first dotted note in each cluster there. Yep. So nope, not that one. The first one in the next, right? So we still want to bring out 2 beats per bar. Or
The one thing I would share, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say real quick, just mention, if that second beat was a cut dot, where would you put the pulsing? Well, you put the pulsing on the dotted note. You never pulse a cut note, right? So you had a takam, da-dum, da-dum. You would pulse out on the long note. The beat emphasis always goes on the long note portion of that beat. So it'd be that low A there. Or sorry, I'm seeing low A on that dotted note, right? Great. Exactly.
And the one thing for those visual people out there, one thing that really helped me, I had a mentor who talked about 2/4 marches and had this, the downbeat was here on the triangle and the upbeat was here. So it would be E, a, cha, and, do, e, da. So it had this up, very much an uplifting feel. Whereas in a reel, more like the infinity loop. And you can see that it's when I get to the lower half, I'm actually moving through it with a little bit more momentum. So that reflects what you're already saying around in terms of holding beat 1 and beat 2.
Great.
Awesome. Right, next tune type then. So hornpipe.
Okay, so now we finished our MSR, and now we've got our 2 last ones we're going to talk about today, which are hornpipes and jigs. So hornpipe is, well, James, how would you distinguish a hornpipe from a reel and a 2/4? To me, it somehow lives somewhere close to those. It's in between a march. It's not a march, but similar, has a lot of overlap, similar to a reel as well. How would you describe it?
Yeah, for me, so the march, we have that agogic stress where we're really leaning on that first beat and we're emphasizing it. Whereas in a hornpipe, it's lighter hearted, it's slightly more elevated tempo, and we don't sit on and emphasize that beat as we would in a 2/4 march. So for me, there's a lot more lift in life.
Yeah, so I think that's right. It's sort of, if you look at the rhythmic patterns, if you look at the rhythmic construction of a hornpipe, it's going to be very similar to a march, but the style of expression, slightly faster, not as heavy on the pulsing. So instead of it'll be just a little bit too heavy and slow and plodding if you took that hornpipe and played it in march style. Same kind of rhythmic patterns, lots of dot cut. If you're going to play the dot cut style tune, there are also styles of hornpipes which are round, we take out all the dot cuts. So we have that as well.
This is what we would call a dot cut hornpipe is what we're looking at. And then what Jori said was playing it rounded. So if we played it round, we would simply take out these dots and cuts, right? Not the stem.
So I think for a dot cut style hornpipe at the upper end, it would be maybe say 85. And at the lower end, it might be 60, somewhere in there. A thing to consider is the difference in tempo between that dot cut style and the round style. And it seems to me that when you play a round style hornpipe, you have to bring the tempo up a little bit so that it feels, so that it sounds good. There's something about when you add the dot cut, it gives it some life and some bounce and some vitality, even when the tempo's down. But once you get rid of those dot cuts, you kind of got to crank it up a little bit. That's something to consider.
And I think that 90 beats per minute there that I've put in, that's more so for those rounded tunes. Playing a dot cut hornpipe at 90 may sound a little unusual, particularly in, yeah, totally. You know, maybe for some dancers doing the sailor's hornpipe, but certainly not from a band performance standpoint. And expression-wise, did we touch on that? I don't think we did yet.
Yeah, so it's just dot cut, plenty of dot cut, and keep that consistent throughout. And I like to do a little bit of pulsing on there. Not too much, it'd be lighter than a 2/4 march, but a little bit of pulsing as well.
Okay, so it's like taking the 2/4 principle and just relaxing a little bit on it.
Yeah. Crank up your tempo and just relax on the pulsing. That's right. And
then jig. So we'll stick with 6/8 jig for now. There's also 9/8 and 12/8, but if we just stick with 6/8, the most common, I would say.
Yeah, so 6/8 notes per bar, clustered in groups of 3. So you're going to see 2 groups of 3/8 notes. That's really the foundational building block of a jig. Now you could combine those first two 1/8 notes, and that'd give you a 1/4 note, and then you'd have an 1/8 note hanging on its own. You could also combine all 3 of those notes together and have a dotted 1/4 note. Yeah. Now on that second line there where you have the 1/8 note going first, that is very rare to see that. You do see it, but it is very rare. If you go back and remember, we talked about in 2/4s when you had the groups of 3, usually the 1/8 note comes first. And that's just because the long note usually comes on the downbeat. That's also the principle in the jig. I would say that 1/8 note coming first is sort of like 1 in every 10,000. You know, it's really, really rare.
That's this one.
Yeah, it could happen. Want to write a tune with it? Go for it. Yeah, it's almost like a little bit of a syncopated feel, but it's almost unheard of. Tempos. So this is where we get to really crank our tempos up here. You know, at the high level, we're talking maybe up to 120 for solo pipers, and then slowing it down to, you know, let's say 85 or something like that. I was playing a recital years ago, and I felt like I was playing really fast, really, really fast. And then I came off and I had recorded it, and I listened back to it, and I was playing like 144 or something. I don't know how I played that fast. I mean, I couldn't do it now, but I think it's a combination of adrenaline and sweat, and it was a hot day.
Thank goodness I was not accompanying you. That would have been disastrous for me.
Would have been great. Yeah, so really what we're looking here, there's no dot cuts, right? So the name of the game in a jig for pipers is keep it even. Keep those 1/8 notes even. You know, some pipers like to talk about pulsing a tiny, tiny bit on that first 1/8 note. I would say that's a very advanced technique, and you can do that, but it's really, really subtle. And for most of us, really what you're focusing on is play the right notes, get all your technique in there, and aim for a very steady, even, smooth delivery of 1/8 notes. That's what you're going for. And in a pipe band situation, I mean, that's some of the most exciting music we play, or we get these jigs cranking and the drummers and the pipers are in sync, and you're just in this groove and just cranking it out. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's for some people who are new to it and going, I can't tell the difference between my Strathspey and my jig. Well, in the Strathspey, you're hearing lots of the dots and cuts, right? You're hearing tut everywhere. Whereas in a jig, you won't hear that, right?
Right. If you wanted to try to figure out, you're hearing a type of tune and you want to try to identify what it is. Well, if it's a pibroch or a slow air, you can pretty much determine that based on the tempo. And then if you want to figure out what it is from what's remaining, you know, does it feel like about the tempo of a marching tune, or does it feel faster than that? If it's faster, then it's going to be one of our dance tunes. And right away you can identify jig, because you're going to hear da 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 1 2 3 1 2 3 jiggity jiggity. If you hear that, you know you're in jig town, right? So that's the jig. If it's not a jig and you're into hornpipe or reel, it gets a little bit trickier, but you ought to be able to figure out the jig there. So keep it even, keep it smooth, and you're golden.
I love it. So guys, that is an overview of our key tune types. And hopefully there's been some key takeaways. And for those that are watching, a couple of things, comment below if you've got any questions. Jori and I'll certainly jump in and check out what you're writing and maybe some challenges you're having. Also, don't forget to hit subscribe below. And we've also got communities. We've got Facebook communities and other communities where we serve pipers and drummers just like yourself. So I know that Jori has created an amazing inner circle. So Jori, can you just take a moment just to maybe give us a bit of an overview of what the inner circle is about?
Yeah, so I started bagpipelessons.com in 1999 with the idea to give anybody anywhere in the world access to good information to learn the pipes. A few years ago, I wanted to do something more in addition to my downloads that I had on my shop. I wanted to do something interactive. So I created the bagpipelessons.com inner circle, and there's a few things that you get on that. You get weekly live group classes with me. And we cover all kinds of topics: tunes, expression, technique, reeds, memorization, learning tips, playing in a band, you name it. We cover these topics live. And if you can't join live, you can watch them on the replay. We have a private Facebook group. You can watch them there. Also, we do our live classes on Zoom. Also, we have a members only website where you get access as a member, and we have recordings of all the live sessions there. And we have hundreds, literally hundreds of lessons on every piping topic imaginable. And we bring in world champion guest instructors as well. So that's my inner circle. And you can check it out at bagpipelessons.com/membership, and would love to have you. We have pipers from around the world of all abilities. So even if you're just starting out, we have people like you that join our classes. And then as you progress, there'll be more and more content that you can access that you'll want to get into.
Amazing. Thank you, Jori. And for everyone that's watching, a couple of things. If you've learned something valuable today, please do us a favor and share this video with someone that might benefit from it. Someone in your band that's been talking about, no, this is how we play this tune, or I think this is how we should express it. Put it out there. And Jori and I are not saying, hey, this is the only way to think about it. But from our experience of playing at the top and teaching between us, 40 plus years, like, we know that this is a really solid way to approach each tune type and very well accepted at all grade levels, both solo piping and band. So please, guys, I'll pop the links below for my YouTube channel, Jori's YouTube channel. There's so much free content in there, so please subscribe to those. And I'll also put a link into my free Facebook group, Pipe Band Drumming on Tap, and you can come in there and check it out. And then I've also got the Pipe Band Drumming Inner Circle, and you can go and check that out at pipebanddrumminginnercircle.com. And in there, it's very similar to Jori's, where I go live twice a week. One is a practical session with sticks in hand. The other's a Q&A or a live composition. I then bring in world champion guest instructors. And in your private members area, there are hundreds of tutorials and previous replays. So I just want to say a huge thank you, Jori. That was phenomenal. I absolutely enjoyed that. And it's nice to actually sit down with you. And we've talked about this informally when we're teaching at workshops, but it's nice to actually formalize this and put it out there for other people.
Great, James. Well, I think this is really cool. Let's do it again. There's so much out there that we could talk about that would be really fun to discuss. I love getting into it. Thanks.
Let's do it. Thanks, man.
Mahalo.